So this second part will be on Laudato Si, and there are two major links between what I said in the first part and Laudato Si. The first one is that, as I said, the lens of the poor is a major lens for Pope Francis to talk about and look at what the Catholic laity mean for the Catholic Church of today. Very important, the poor in general, not the poor that are Catholics, or the poor in Catholic countries, or the poor globally. So this is really part of what is, I believe, inspiring of this Pope, of this pontificate. So that's a first element that is very visible in Laudato Si. The second element is this, is that historically, but also today, when we talk about the role of the lay people in the church, is also, if not mostly, about power in the church. And this is very important because I strongly believe that Laudato Si is an encyclical on our common home, on creation, on the environment. But I think that the most radical way to look at Laudato Si is as an encyclical on power. What is power in the world of today? How it works? What is the Catholic take on power in the world of today? The power of politics, the power of the economy, the power of science, of public opinion, of businesses. It's a very, very interesting picture that this Pope has on the issue of our common home. It's worth remember here that, again, it's one of these documents that we will still read, will be reading for a long time, but it was published in 2015, in June of 2015. It was before the election and before the beginning of the campaign of Donald Trump, before Brexit, before a number of things. So that helps us understand the acceleration in the disruption of globalization that we have seen in these last few years. So here, I'm going to give you a few key expressions, a few key ideas that are in this text, which is, as a professor, one of the most interesting texts to teach students today. Because they get it. I mean, it's very, very present to them, the issue of the environment. And through the issue of the environment, I can build a theological discourse on a number of issues. So here, the first important point that I think is related to the theme of the laity is paragraph 49, when there is this very powerful expression that talks about the need to listen to the earth and listen to the poor. These things in Laudato Si are together. There's no listening to the earth that is disconnected from the social justice issues, from the issue of marginalization within one society, in Western society, or marginalization of some countries. It's important because Francis talks about Mother Earth as the poorest of the poor. It's almost a cosmological embodiment that may call back some cosmologies of Hawaii, for example, that I can remember, or some indigenous cosmologies. And he's not afraid of talking about Mother Earth as a person. So in this, there is the beginning of a series of texts in this encyclical that I believe say a lot about what Pope Francis thinks about the lay people in the church. For example, paragraph 50, there is this paragraph on the rejection of the Catholic Church of the demographic of the rejection of the thesis of those who say that the major problem for the future, the sustainable future of the earth is overpopulation. Okay? So this is old stuff. Okay, so this is actually one of the driving forces of Humane Vitae. I mean, how Pope Francis reads Humane Vitae, 1968, Paul VI becoming famous for rejecting contraception for Catholics. He reads Humane Vitae as an anti-Western project that in the late 60s was telling poor countries will give you aid for development if you stop having children. The architect of the Vietnam War, Robert McNamara, in 1967, he resigns from the defense ministry. He goes on and becomes the president of the World Bank. And what does the World Bank do? It gives aid to developing nations. And Robert McNamara, the embodiment of the 20th century technocrat, the brightest, Harvard, educated, and so on, he said, okay, India, we'll help you if you sterilize X million of women. And so Humane Vitae is a reaction against this as well as against the Pope. So Pope Francis interprets Humane Vitae as an anti-colonialist project, basically. McNamara, it's interesting because he had a moment of repentance for the Vietnam War and so on, and he ended up getting marrying his second wife in Assisi. From Vietnam to the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. It's a long way. So, what's interesting in this paragraph 50 is that Pope Francis says the Catholic Church doesn't believe that overpopulation is the biggest problem for the future of the earth. At the same time, he says the Catholic Church is not for limitless production of children. So this is one of the things that they reproach him to be part of the contraceptive culture, as some call it. So here Pope Francis is having a different take from John Paul II and Pope Benedict on what is the voice of the laity about family, marriage, contraception, and what it means for the environment. So here, I believe at some point the Catholic Church will have to deal with overpopulation at some point. But what is interesting of Pope Francis is that for him, the voice of the laity is much more than being on the receiving end of the clerical prohibition of contraception. And you see that across the spectrum of everything he has said that is important, including Laudato Si. So and this has created some interesting moments. If you follow Pope Francis' profession, especially when he was flying back from the Philippines, January 2015, when in the press conference on the flight back to Rome, he famously said, Catholics should not be like rabbits and have an unlimited number of that didn't fly with many Catholics in the US. So he has this, I mean, politically incorrect way of talking about things. Okay. But so what's important is that he has been in touch with an experience of lay people that is not seen from a distance, from the episcopal palace, the chancery, where Humane Vitae is the most practical way of dealing with sexuality. It's more complicated. There's another part that I think it's an interesting call to the laity, because he's showing that I think there is a Catholic deep understanding of the world. As I said, we live in an age that is dealing with the crisis of globalization, and there is a cluster of paragraphs, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, that is much about what lay people can do and how Catholic lay people are invited to think about the world of today. In 51, he says we should rethink international relations because they have become, in issues of heavily indebted countries, new forms of slavery. So here, it's something that especially for lay Catholics that are in positions of responsibility in businesses, in government, it's very practical. That, I mean, that, this argument says, has become a new way of enslaving poor nations. And this is obviously coming from an Argentinian. In 52, he says, debt has become a new form of control that is extra legal, that is way more influential than anything the United Nations may say about international justice. In 54, there is an interesting paragraph on the relationship between politics, the economy, and information. So this is one of the most interesting paragraphs, because he says, our world, where the economic paradigm dominates everything, that has distorted deeply our sense of truth. Because the information we are given is systematically, on some issues, in some countries, is systematically manipulated by those who have a certain interest in letting you know something, in manipulating some truths, and or in keeping you in the dark or something. So here, this is very directly calling Catholics to a healthier relationship with the media, for example, and Catholic media. In the United States, the most active Catholics who have an agenda in making this papacy unbridgeable for American Catholics are exactly Catholics who are in some Catholic televisions. I mean, EWTN. I mean, this is every night you have a show that is saying on every possible issue exactly the opposite of what the official teaching of the Catholic Church says. I mean, not this Pope or the other Pope, but on taxation, on death penalty, on healthcare reform, all this kind of thing. So it's systematic. And so that is the most Catholic television of all. And it's lay run. So it's, I mean, the bishops have nothing, I mean, they should say something about it. They don't, but it's not their business. And so here, this is, I think, an important element. In 64, there is one of the typical ways of Francis to think about the church in terms of humanization. So this Pope Francis is very much a cleric, a man who became a Jesuit really in the 1970s. And so the 1970s was when the Catholic Church was not afraid to say, before evangelizing, we should humanize. There's no way you can become a Christian, a Catholic, a priest, if I dismiss your human dimension. So, the first time an official Catholic teaching text says something about priestly formation, for example, on the fact that before becoming a good priest, you should be a psychologically healthy human being, is 1992. So before then, it was taken for granted, or the idea was that ordination will heal everything. So we know from the scandals that this is exactly the opposite. I mean, ordination tends to make some problems worse. 1992, which the coincidence is also the same year when the Catholic Church officially rehabilitated Galileo, 359 years after his condemnation. We have to be patient sometimes. So here he says what the Catholic Church wants to do is to open, quote, paths of liberation. So, as you know, Pope Francis has never been a liberation theologian, technically. As a young Jesuit, he was very much skeptical on liberation theology in Latin America in the 1970s, and for quite some time he has been seen as an enemy of liberation theology. Nevertheless, he uses that kind of language, so which is interesting. So that shows you why it's a good thing that he's not an academic theologian. Because academic theologian tends to stick to the thesis. He's aware that it's impossible to think about Catholicism today, dealing with the earth, the poor, social justice, without talking about liberation. So he's not afraid of saying the Catholic Church wants to open liberation. Importantly, he said, in doing this, the Church doesn't want to be alone. We want to do this with other churches, other faiths, and people of no faith. We have to be allied with those who share. And this is clearly something that comes from an eminently lay experience. It's the lay people that has been historically more experienced, more comfortable in cooperating on some important issues with non-Catholics, non-Christians. In paragraph 90, there is a very strong passage against inequality. And this is something interesting, especially today, because it has become out of fashion to advocate for some kind of basic equality, social equality, economic the typical, when you talk about this, for example, in the United States, the usual Catholic response from the conservative side is you're envious, you're jealous of those who are rich. It has become the standard response. So this is a very countercultural message of this Pope. He says, if we believe that we are a people as a church, and that we are one people as passengers on the earth, so we don't own the earth, we are passengers on the earth, that we should restore some sense of equality. And not in theory. So, as you know, the Catholic Church is indebted to the French Revolution, to the Enlightenment for some ideas. So the Catholic Church doesn't like to acknowledge that, but it is clear that the idea of human rights or individual rights, it comes not from the Catholic, proper legacy, but it comes from a juridical philosophical stream. And so we know that the French Revolution has been quite successful in these last 227 years or so, in affirming that there is a fundamental sense of equality, in theory, at least there is a fundamental sense of liberty, the freedom as a value. We all know that of those three famous principles of the French Revolution, the major failure has been about fraternity. And Pope Francis' view of the church, and that matters for what he thinks about the lay people, is that the Catholic Church is made of brothers and sisters, is a people. This is interesting because the Catholic view of the church, historically, especially after the first millennium, the second millennium especially, has always been an ecclesiology very structured, very layered. Lay people, lay women at the bottom of the ladder. That is obvious for sometimes semi-human we'll consider. So lay people, monks, the priests, bishops, cardinals, patriarchs, and so very structured. And so this is one of the major differences between the Catholic and Orthodox ecclesiology and the Reformation. Francis here, so I believe he is very Catholic. I'm not saying that he's Protestant, but his view of the church is quite flat when he talks about the church. So it's a bit different when he governs. It's much more complicated. But when he talks about the church, I'm happy that I'm a layperson because I haven't been insulted by this Pope as much as bishops have. I don't know how this Pope would think that this language would help him with the bishops. It's very hard to imagine how a bishop is naturally inclined to see this Pope as an ally. And so this is a real problem of this pontificate, and I don't think it will be solved. At paragraph 93-94, there is very powerful a retrieval of the great tradition of the Catholic Church, Gaudium et Spes, the Second Vatican Council, but that goes back to the Middle Ages, saying that there is a universal destination of wealth and of goods, which is as countercultural as it gets today, especially in some quarters of Anglo-Saxon Catholicism, especially the Catholicism of the neo-converts, from Protestant to the Catholic Church, from Calvinist to the Catholic Church, who basically say that if you're poor, you deserve what you get, and if you're rich, you deserve what you get, and if you're poor, you get what you deserve. That's why they don't like Pope Francis in the United States. That is one of the major reasons. And pay attention, this comes, so this animus, this sentiment against Francis as one who's fundamentally undermining the capitalistic system is a lay-driven movement. Those are lay Catholics, mostly, who have power, who have money, who have the bishops, have no big problems with this, at least until they have to go with their hat in hand and ask millions from this rich donor or the other. But this is a problem in the lay people. As you know, there are different kinds of difficult receptions of Pope Francis, especially in the US. Amoris Laetitia, very difficult for bishops. Laudato Si, very difficult for lay people in position of power. This encyclical is calling lay Catholics in some countries to do exactly the opposite of what they're doing. And this is a big, big obstacle. There is a section that is the intellectual core of this encyclical when Pope Francis defines what is the problem with the thinking in the world of today, the thinking of those who have power. And he says the major problem is that everything has to work according to what he calls the technocratic paradigm. The technocratic paradigm, where everything has to be measured, has to be counted, has to have economic value, has to be accountable to some powerful interests. This is important for the lay people in the church because this is something that has happened across the spectrum, the ideological spectrum in Catholicism, in the lay people. And so Pope Francis doesn't say that, but I think he really thinks that. He says why the issue of the environment, of the common home, of justice is so difficult? Because it is something that happened because of a convergence that is post-ideological. So here, he says the technocratic paradigm is not just something that is the responsibility of the right or of the left. So there are different ways of being enslaved to the technocratic paradigm. If you look, for example, at how in some Catholic schools, Catholic universities in the US, they are implementing evaluations, for example, assessments. So this is the ideal typical technocratic paradigm. So the idea that you can understand everything of what happens in a classroom with numbers. So this document is calling for a non-polarizing interpretation of the problem with this technocratic paradigm. And he says that this paradigm has manipulated science by making scientists say that there is an infinite, unlimited availability of the resources of the earth. That says that technology is neutral and it's all about how to use it. And so this argument says technology is not neutral. There are technological devices that are inherently bad. And there's no imaginable good use of some technological advancements. And so this is not very popular in the Western world to say that this paradigm dominates politics, the economy, and he says the church is about liberation, and when it is about the earth, our common home, the first step is to liberate ourselves from the technocratic paradigm. Why? Because this document says we have distorted one of the principles of the Catholic worldview, that is that the human being is at the center of everything. So this document is interesting because it says there's no thinkable centrality of the human person without considering the rest of creation. If you think of the human person at the center, abstract from creation, you will destroy that center. And so this is new because, as you know, one of the arguments of conservative Catholic culture, theological culture, is, for example, that the centrality of the human person allows us to give humans unlimited power to pillage the earth. This is the standard response of some, for example, white evangelical churches in the US, where they say, well, we have dominion on the earth, so nothing can stop us because we are in charge here. And so this is not the Catholic version of this issue that is in this encyclical. And it's interesting because this encyclical, and so you can see how slow the progress of the church is on some issues, has a direct quote of one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, Teilhard de Chardin, a French Jesuit, who was the elephant in the room at the Second Vatican Council. Why? Because he had been silenced by the Holy Office in 1960. So which is the reason why Vatican II, in Gaudium et Spes, when he talks about science, never talks about evolution. Not because they were thinking about monogenism, Adam and Eve, and so on. Because they know that if we talk about evolution, we should talk about Teilhard de Chardin. We can't because he has just been condemned, so we're not saying anything about evolution. This encyclical is not afraid of talking about evolution. And it's interesting because the encyclical says, evolution, it's still here, it's still happening. We have to be part of an evolutionary idea of creation. We have to help nature to develop according to its essence. So this is very, very interesting. So as you know, in these last 20 years more or less, there has been some revival in Catholic circles that that evolution, Charles Darwin, was bad. So this is, I mean, Pope Francis laughs a lot about this. I mean, he has concerns that are different than this. But so this encyclical and this passage on evolution is interesting because it shows us one of the most interesting turns of history that we are witnessing with this Pope, which is this. historically, the Catholic Church, especially between the origins of modern science, until a few decades ago, you had scientists in one camp and the Catholic Church in the other camp. Now, the most visible advocate of science is Pope Francis, and the President of the United States is in the anti-science camp. So I think Galileo is really, really smiling a lot wherever he is, because this is an incredible term. Until a few decades ago, you have the Catholic Church very concerned that the scientific paradigm was going to take over. Now, if you read Pope Francis, this text and other, he says science exists and it's important for us, and things will be worse for all of us, including Catholics, if we start thinking that science doesn't exist or that the earth is flat. So it's a remarkable turn of things. Remarkable in a few years, because if you remember, the last pope who expressed some qualms, some doubts on the fact that Catholics should be enthusiastic about science was Pope Benedict, who's not an earth is flat kind of person, but as an intellectual, he always tried to find the sweet spot to finesse. Now, Pope Francis says, we have people who say that climate change doesn't exist. The Catholic Church has to say something in defense of science. It is a stunning change, and that explains why, when this encyclical was presented to the public in the Vatican, June 2015, they invited in the Holy See Press Office a non-believer scientist, which I got this invitation. I think he thought they had made a mistake, but so this is important, and I go to the conclusion. For Catholic lay people, why? Because one of the effects of the crisis of globalization, of this disruption of globalization, is that we have become much more skeptical that a certain way of being citizens matters. This is an eminently lay problem, because there are things that in this world only lay Catholics can do. Lay Catholics of a certain kind, or that are consumers, that have businesses, that are in education, that are in healthcare. So here, this Pope is really trying, I think, to recover a Catholic sense of being part of this human journey. I was reading last night a book review of a book on the Labour Prime Minister in post-World War II England, Clement Attlee. And there's a remarkable line in his diary, 1916, 1917, during World War I, when he's thinking about politics, but it is 30 years before he became Prime Minister, and he says, when he's thinking about creating a healthcare system for England, for example, of health insurance for all workers, he says, and he was anti-clerical, anti-religious. He says, I have understood the importance of my interior Catholicism, small c Catholicism. So there is a view of society, of politics, of the economy, that during World War I he understood that was important for all of us, Catholics, non-Catholics. This is what is in crisis today. So the idea that it's much better to have a safety net for the poor or the weak has become again a morally questionable position. And so Catholic laity have an exclusive role. The hierarchy here can do very, very little. Second, there is a very strong emphasis in Laudato Si on the fact that we live in one global community. You can call it globalization, internationalist, transcontinental. This is one human family. As you know, many countries, especially countries where Catholics are in power, we are in a new age of neo-nationalism. In the worst of the cases, ethno-nationalism. If you read the speech given by the Prime Minister of Hungary 4 days ago to a bunch of students in Hungary, it is chilling. It sounds the 1930s. The 1930s. So he's not Catholic personally, but all Catholic bishops in Hungary are very happy with him. This is our time. And finally, as I said, there is the idea that the church and science, they are allied in this moment. And this is interesting because it reframes some, history of, Galileo and so on, but also it creates a real rift between the Catholic Church and other religious communities. And not just Islam, but even Protestant communities in the United States. So here there is a real difference that this document is making evident. So I will stop here because I think I take more time than I should have. So stop here and yeah. This theology on the role of the lay people, what Pope Francis has said in Laudato Si. What are some of the practical challenges that I think a lay Catholic organization, any Catholic organization faces today? In no particular order, I have a list of big issues. The first and the biggest is what kind of relationship between the Catholic Church and power, especially political power and economic power, we have. In this sense, that for centuries, especially in the European Catholicism and all the peripheries of European Catholicism, the idea was the Catholic Church is integral system of power, of colonial power, of economic power. It was integrated. There was no distinction. The Catholic Church had some moderating effect on capitalism, but it was not antagonist, or it was not as an outsider. And then Vatican II came in the 60s. And one of the ideas was that the Catholic Church's voice can be much more prophetic if it adopts a totally antagonistic posture as an outsider. That prophecy works only if you're free from the compromises that you have to make with those who are in power, in politics, in the economy, and so on. So this, I believe, in this moment, is going through some kind of reconsideration. Why is that? Because I believe that Pope Francis on the one side, is very much cast as an antagonist of the technocratic paradigm and so on. On the other hand, if you look at how Pope Francis deals in practice with the role of the Catholic Church in world affairs, for example, he is much more pragmatic in the sense that he knows that there is some good that the Catholic Church can do without becoming too romantic about being a rebel that enjoys this status of being a rebel, but it's left out of the room when the decisions are made, and is left out when arguments are made, especially. So here Pope Francis is interesting because I understood a lot in April 2016 when he went to visit the refugee camp in the island of Lesbos in Greece with the Patriarch of Constantinople. And one of the things that he did, the last thing he did, was to take on the papal flight back to Rome 12 refugees that were non-Christian refugees. How could he do that technically? Well, because he's the sovereign of a state. So which is something that the Patriarch of Constantinople cannot do, or the Archbishop of Westminster cannot do. So here, I'm not saying that we should go back to the Middle Ages and rebuild the papal states and all that, because this is clearly unthinkable. But there is a certain Catholic pragmatism that we have to find, and especially you who are in a especially important ministry, between the prophetic role and the pragmatic role of finding the money to keep this thing going. So this is, I'm not teaching anything new here, but the theological reflection sometimes tends to become abstract and to say we should always do this because being compromised. There are a lot of things that can be done only through compromise. And so this is, I believe, interesting in how Pope Francis is saying things that are very clear. At the same time, is not being ideological in his approach to how Catholics should deal with very practical issues of migrants and of refugees. And so this is the first thing that this pontificate and this crisis of globalization has, I think, brought back. The second big issue is the relationship between church and money. In this sense, that what this pontificate is being very outspoken about is about the heresy of the prosperity gospel. As you know, the prosperity gospel is this new kind of Christian theology that comes from the United States and then migrates in these last few decades in Latin America and in Africa, especially, which says that one of the ways of counting the blessings that you receive from God is through counting your money. And the richer you are, the more blessed you are by God. So it's about financial wealth and health. So if you are poor and you're sick, God doesn't love you very much. So this is something that is being part of how in some areas of the world Christianity is about. And in some Catholic churches as well, this theology is creeping as part of something that is not directly stated. So it was interesting that a couple of weeks ago, the Jesuit magazine Civiltà Cattolica, the Rome-based Jesuit magazine Civiltà Cattolica, published a very strong article criticizing the prosperity gospel and the reluctance of some Catholics to take a position against this. So one thing that we should know is that every issue and every article of Civiltà Cattolica are always vetted and approved by the Vatican. So this article was evidently approved by the Vatican. And so this is Pope Francis speaking through the Jesuits. So this is a huge challenge, I think, because the rejection of the idea of a universal destination of goods, the rejection of the idea that there is a fundamental equality, social equality, economic equality, that are gospel values, that are Christian values, that has led to this idea that if you are a good Christian loved by God, you will be rich and healthy. So it's one of the new heresies. So we had Arianism in the early centuries, we had other heresies. That is a heresy. And this is really part of the picture, I think, of Christianity today. There is an important issue, and I think I've learned a lot from my visits to Australia in these last 3 years, that there is a very important issue with our international order. So here, Catholicism has structured itself in history as a global Catholic Church always. And so one of the biggest dangers for the popes, for those who are thinking what kind of shape the Catholic Church should take, was the danger of national churches, of national Catholicisms, which is roughly what happened to the Orthodox churches. So you have a Russian Orthodox church with a Russian patriarch and so on. So this is one of the things that I think might happen, because we live in an age that is a crisis of globalization, a crisis of our international order, and there are some symptoms of the idea that there are some Christians, some Catholics that are saying we would be a better church if we are more independent from other churches, from Rome, from the structures of communion, of international communion. So this is, I observed this from Australia, because this is something that I haven't seen here. It may be the geographical location of Australia. I think that in the Catholic Church in Australia there is a much stronger sense of the value of diversity that I haven't seen in the United States. I'll give you one example. The fact that every meeting begins with the acknowledgement of country is totally unthinkable in the United States. the idea is that white Christians have always been there, and there was nobody before them. It is really tragic. It is really tragic. I think Canada had done something in the direction, the idea that Christianity was part of colonization. There's a history. It is part of a very small slice of American Catholics. But this is not part of the collective memory. So, again, I think the Australian Catholic Church has a lot to teach. Even if I heard something, yes, we have done this, but in New Zealand they have done more. Okay? Anyway, it's a very stark contrast from the United States. And it's not about just being nice to those who are custodians. It's a different way of locating the church in the world. And of locating your history as a Catholic community on the land, and in the global church. So I feel that the Catholic Church in Australia has a stronger sense, historical but also spiritual, so that's a spirituality that I have smelled, that we are passengers on this earth, and we don't own the ship. So this is a great gift that I think that because there are churches, there are Catholic churches in the world of today that are very, very much in danger of becoming national churches or churches at the service of nationalist governments, nationalist parties. And Catholics play a big role in this. If you look at Poland, Hungary, Italy, some Italian Catholics. So it's about, again, not just writing books on the tragedy that some aspect of missions have had, but also of developing a spirituality of creation, a spirituality of evolution that is really part of what I think Pope Francis is saying. This is a big educational challenge in the schools, in the media, in communication. One thing that Laudato Si is telling us is that there's no other option than living together in this world. There's no Earth being, or no Mars that is available. So why is this important today? Because the realization that there is a new order of relations between the church and faith and religion on one side, and a multicultural, secular, plural dimension on the other side, in every country, this is in every country, is leading some leading Catholic intellectuals to make proposals for different versions of withdrawal options. So they say modernity has failed Christianity, modernity is the enemy of religion, it's getting worse, so therefore the only way for us to be Christian, to stay Christian, is to withdraw from the world. So this there's a very important, successful book that was published in the United States last year called The Benedict Option. You may have heard of it. that is being translated in many languages, especially for European countries, Eastern European countries, which says our world is like the world that Benedict, the father of the Benedictine tradition, found in the 5th century, basically the rubbles of the Roman Empire. And he said the only way to rebuild this world, the post-Roman Empire world, is to build walls around the community and to start living in small communities that are all very committed, they have the same lifestyle, and so this is being, received as the option. And it's interesting that this author is saying the beginning of the end of the Christian civilization became visible when in the United States in 2015 same-sex marriage became legal in the 50 states because of the ruling of the Supreme Court. And so there is a certain take on what is the end of the Catholic world for this kind of mentality. It's not Hiroshima, it's same-sex marriage. And the Obama presidency. So he's the first black president. So the one big challenge, so these are, small groups. I don't think that option will be the option that will survive. But there is now a very strong sense that it has become very difficult, if not impossible, living as Christians together with others that are non-Christians or Christians that are different from us. So the idea that we have to share one space, one community, has become very unpopular. So it is the crisis of multiculturalism and so on. So in this, those who are in education, in politics, I think they play a very important role, because the big challenge, I think, is to understand that there is a secular dimension that is good for the church. So there's this idea that if we just could go back to the Middle Ages, and that is the naive but benign version, and then there's this naive and nasty version that if we only could go back to fascism, when everybody was Catholic, I think we're fine. So there is a big challenge about rediscovering that the secular dimension is a given. It's unthinkable to go back to the idea that one religion is in charge of legislating morality for all of us, on marriage, on everything. So here, how to be a prophetic voice on the one side, knowing that we live in a secular society, is hard, because as you know, the prophetic culture, the model of the prophetic voice, it comes from the Old Testament, where the secular dimension doesn't exist. So here we have to find out how to be a prophet at the service of our common humanity in a secular space, plural space. Here there are, I think, 3 spheres where I think the Catholic lay people have a special role, and I wasn't thinking about Australia here, but there's something that I think can be applied. The first, those who are in education. So here, I don't want to scare you, but this is a great quote of of a schoolmaster of one of the most important Catholic schools in England. I don't remember the name of the school, but I remember this when he was asked, together with other Catholic school masters, what is the mission of the Catholic school, and the others say, we should prepare them for success, for Westminster, for that. And he said, no, Catholic education is to prepare students for death. How to think about everything in a Christian perspective, where everything in the end will make sense even if we die. And so I'm not telling you to have that in your mission statement. That will not be very popular. But I take this as a great vaccine against the idea that there is no difference between Catholic education and Harvard. So where everything is about success, everything is about, so I want my children to be successful. There's no question about that. I'm just trying not to become enslaved to that kind of paradigm. So this is very countercultural. I think that is more countercultural than, for example, defending some teachings of the Catholic Church on sexuality. So I think there is a challenge that especially lay people like me in education, because I teach students, most of my time during my winter is teaching students, is to show them that there is something else other than the dominant paradigm of where everything that matters can be counted, and what cannot be measured, it doesn't matter. So it is difficult when the school has to survive on the market, especially in the US. So, but I think here there are a special role for lay people. A second sphere is Catholic healthcare. My grandfather was a physician, my father was a physician. I broke the tradition. So there is something I think that is subject to a special kind of pressure today, that is Catholic healthcare, that is called to be healthcare period. This is an extremely complicated, I have no recipe. I see what's happening in the United States. There's a very big push to get rid of Catholic hospitals in rural areas, especially because they don't provide some services that are considered human rights, like abortion in the US. As you know, in the US, abortion is a constitutional right. That makes the whole picture incredibly complicated. And so here, this is really much of what has been called the medicalization of our society. I mean, Ivan Illich, if you want. So that's an extremely sensitive area. I don't think the bishops will have much to say about it, because it's very complicated for them to understand the issue. You have to be a lay Catholic that knows what's going on there. There's no way that we can say, well, let the hierarchy, the bishops, it's way beyond their ability to understand things. So here the Catholic laity has a unique function. There's no Thomas Aquinas anymore that can know everything. That's not true. And finally, the issue of communication, of media, of language. As you know, one of the most followed leaders in the world on social media is Pope Francis. That doesn't say anything about how the Catholic Church is handling this. We are still at the beginning of this. And I think we need to be careful in how we use it, because one example. There's one American priest who's a member of the Pontifical Commission for Social Communication, the Vatican building that handles the documents on media, social media. So they are drafting a document on social media. And in the whole doc, and this priest asked me to read it because it's in Italian. He cannot read Italian, so he asked me, tell me what I should tell them. And so I read this. And in this document, it talks about a lot of things, Twitter, Facebook, and so on. He doesn't say anything once on a theological Catholic idea of what is the Word, Revelation, Bible, totally absent. So it sounds very modern. It sounds as if a techie from the Silicon Valley, but there's nothing theological. If you look at the profile of Pope Francis on Instagram, I mean, one way to call it is papal porn. Really, I mean, Pope Francis doing this, doing that. I don't know. Okay, so here we should be careful in how, as Catholics, especially in the school, we use that kind of tools. Because this is having a huge impact. If you want, I mean, religion, including Catholicism, has always counted on some level of distance, of being aware that the divine, to be understood, needs some distance. You cannot watch the sun. Our communication media is eliminating totally every idea of distance, of healthy distance between you and me, between otherness. It is becoming pornographic in some sense. There's an immediacy that can become destructive. Healthy human relations count on some distance. That is respect. That once we call it reverence. Right? So here social media is disrupting this completely. And this changes the way we interact with one another in our school system, in our families. It is really penetrating every aspect of our life. And again, here, the Catholic official thinking is taken by a number of other issues. I mean, they are handling emergency, basically. It's about the lay people coming up with some wisdom about how to deal with this. Discernment, again, not theological commentaries, but some sense of caution for this particular aspect of our technological modernity. So these are just two examples that come from my experience as a professor, as a lay Catholic. And I hope that they say something to you. And I think I'll stop here.